Perfect. Hey, everyone, and welcome to Chef AJ Live. I'm your host, Chef AJ, and this is where I introduce you to amazing people like you who are doing great things in the world that I think you should know about. You know, there have been many dynamic duos throughout history, from Anthony to Cleopatra to Batman and Robin, but none so dynamic as my guests today, who are the face of Esteemed Dynamics, a wonderful website where you can glean so much knowledge and information and even book a private session with either of them. But they are so generous with their time. They come back once a month when they can to answer your questions. Please welcome back our favorite guests, Dr. Jen Howk and Dr. Doug Lisle. Thanks for coming on. We really appreciate our time with you.
Yeah, it's good to be here. Doug gets to make his bad joke this time.
Thank you, AJ. Glad to be here. All good.
Well, I'm sure you guys know, maybe even in your private practice, that the holidays are coming up and a lot of people are freaking out. It's a big deal to a lot of people, both in terms of worrying about going off plan and not being able to get back on, or seeing family members and how to navigate these holidays. So it figures that the first question is from Morgan. It's kind of long. I'll read it fast. Holidays are upon us. I've been estranged from my mom for almost 5 years, except for snail mail here and there. My mom has borderline personality disorder, and she is specifically impacted by a plethora of lifestyle diseases. Thanksgiving week, my 4 siblings are going to be in the area, and I'm feeling open to getting together with them and my mom, with my husband and kids, not for a full Thanksgiving gathering, something more casual. When I think about seeing my mom, my insides literally quake and I break out in a sweat. I only sort of want to see her. However, I think that seeing her in a group setting where the expectations for interactions are low and I can leave if I need to may be a better case scenario. The experience of her has always been crushing to me. Any tips on how to navigate a reunion without letting it steamroll me? I'm sure you've heard some variations of this question before.
Well, I have a few things I would say, and then Jen, I'm sure is going to have things I miss. But first thing is that probably it is important and useful to figure out exactly in what way that you are going to extricate yourself and when. So it's a really good idea to have this to be a pre-planned, not very long encounter, whatever it is. Maybe it's 90 minutes somewhere. Maybe it's, we're eating pumpkin pie somewhere at some place. Who knows what it is? And second of all, it's a positive thing, and that we're going to learn something, because it's probably a bad idea. Okay, so we have to, rather than being so anxious about it, the attitude is, look, I'm probably making a mistake here. So this is probably going to be an unpleasant pain in the ass. It's probably the same old mom, and it's Groundhog Day all over again. But we're going to set it up. It's been 5 years, and about every 5 years, you should sort of test a hypothesis like this, because, it's your mom, and how much longer is she going to live, et cetera. So we're going to give her, we're going to give her one more look this decade, and we're going to take one more bite of the apple of the knowledge and find out if we get tossed out of our personal Eden again. And we might. Okay, so that's why, though, we need to have a very good, slick, socially appropriate plan for how we're going to slither out and leave. Finally, the last thing is that you can call it borderline personality disorder, but that's just modern psychiatry not knowing what's really going on. It's actually highly disagreeable and unstable. That's all it is. So it's no more mystical than that. And it sounds like our lady here inherited some of the instability, which is why it is that she's very anxious. She didn't inherit the disagreeability, or she'd be the same, full-fledged that her mother is. So, but you've got the instability in there, which is what's making this challenging. But remember that the real fundamental difference between you and your mom is the fact that she's very disagreeable with the instability. So what causes people to be disagreeable? They're very touchy about their status. And so remember that all that you pretty much need to do to literally dodge every baseball that she throws at you. See, Jen, a sports thing.
There's the sports already, and we're 9 minutes in. Although I have to say, I'm surprised it's baseball and not basketball. So,
yes,
we're really expanding our repertoire here. more moving toward greater inclusivity all the time.
Inch by inch. Point is that your all you have to do to survive is to realize your job is to figure out how to flatter your mother. Okay. And don't go over the top and make it ridiculously obvious. But your first move when she attacks you for some reason, because there's a bunch of baggage on the table and she can't help herself, then your job is to send back positive signals. That's it. You can send back enough positive signals for this thing to probably hold together for an hour and a half. Just about the time you feel like, you can't stand it because it's tilted too unfairly in her direction and you just need to even the score a little bit, that's when you are actually constructing your own fiasco. If you stay right on tack and say exactly, you walk the line, and the line is flatter, 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 flatter. It's the flattery line, okay? If you walk right on top of that flattery line with your mother, and that's what you do, you can survive the hour and a half and everything is fine. If you don't, if she insults you and we bite her hand back, then we're going to get a fiasco. That doesn't mean you failed. It just means you're human. So, but the point is, this is very survivable. You're walking in there basically ready to give your mother nothing other than positive feedback with the small amount of interchanges that you're going to have. You're otherwise going to avoid, okay, what are we going to flatter her with? She looks great. Her shoes are great. Her hair is great. The earwax coming out of her left ear is great. Everything about her is great. Okay. So everything looks great. So, yeah, etc. That's all we're going to be doing is positive, positive, positive feedback. That you should be able to survive. You can survive Joseph Stalin if you do that well enough. Okay. And not be the guy that gets your head chopped off. So we should be able to survive this with your mother, and yet you will have all those anxious feelings and feelings of dread and feelings like this was a bad idea because it probably is a bad idea. But no problem, and we won't do it for another 5 years, and this will satiate you, okay? Every now and then I eat watermelon on an empty stomach because I love watermelon, and yet if I eat it on an empty stomach, I'm in agony for about 20 minutes. So about once a year, I can't keep my snout out of it because for some reason there it is. And I'm thinking, well, I'll just eat a little bit of it. And then I do it again. So hopefully if I live long enough, I'll do this another 30 times. And so hopefully, your mother lives long enough that you get to do this another few times, but let's make it every 5 years instead of every year.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. I will say that as somebody who has both successfully and unsuccessfully tried to deploy the flatter, flatter, flatter strategy, it's not always possible. Like you could be in a situation where even like this requires a fair amount of emotional stability and agreeableness to pull off. And so if you can't do it, it's not the end of the world. So I've been in situations where I can do it. I've been in other situations where I feel so status deficient already that I just don't want to give the other person the satisfaction. It's just impossible for me, even though I recognize I had a coworker like this who, if I went in and complimented her necklace and her new phone case or whatever, and I started off like that, it just greased the wheels of the whole interaction. She was so much easier to deal with. You don't get an infinite amount of time from one compliment. You have to keep it up. You have to keep feeding them sugar. And I would get to a point where she would just say some snarky, bitchy thing. And I just couldn't keep doing it. I was like, no, I know this will make my life easier, but I can't give her the satisfaction of winning because I am not willing to sacrifice all the status in this interaction. It's not a problem. That's just when you go back to what Doug is saying, where you're mathematizing the misery. This is the concept we use here, where it's a finite amount of time. You're only there for this one dinner, this one interaction. It's not forever. And it's an important piece of information to plug into your calculus going forward. And he also touched on the other concept, which is so important, which is this we came up with this description of Groundhog Day to describe interactions with most people, including family members and coworkers and friends, where pretty much every interaction is very predictable and similar because personality is so stable. The personality characteristics that people are born with stay with them throughout their lifetime. And the kind of relationship that you have with any other person is really just a function of the very stable personalities that the two of you were bringing to that interaction. And because the underlying personalities don't change, the nature of the interaction is unlikely to change very much. So it's Groundhog Day, whether it's a good day or a bad day. It's pretty consistent and predictable with most relationships, unless they're really big, exogenous, crazy external events that affect the dynamic. But if it's just business as usual, you pretty much know what to expect, but it is good to confirm it now and then.
Well, you know, it's funny. I agree with both of you, because when I've taken Dr. Lisle's advice in the past and thrown status at people, it's worked like a charm. But I also agree with you, Dr. Howk, that with some people, just
can't do it. Can't always be done.
So,
yeah.
You know, it's just.
Oh, we know who that person is, don't we, AJ?
Yeah, absolutely. But you know, it has worked in situations where people, but it's hard. And you know, this is one of the things you said, Dr. Lisle. I've actually never heard you say it, at least, you know, in a broadcast with me. And I wrote it down. What causes people to be disagreeable is the very something about their status. I've never heard you say that.
Yes, it's the status deficiency, and so that's what causes all of us to get defensive and pissy, and so that's what it is. And yet the disagreeable people are they're walking around inherently more status deficient.
They're already feeling that way.
Yeah, they're feeling like they're not getting their due, whether it's from the clerk at Macy's or the waitress or their workplace or even their mate. In other words, they're always edgy about that situation. And so that's the fundamental dynamic that's sitting under there.
Well, it makes
sense.
I
know who I'm talking about, AJ.
And in one of these cases, that person really didn't get their due, so it makes sense.
Yes.
Yeah. I want to say, is there any problem you guys can't solve? And like what you said is, if it seems like not a good idea, it probably isn't a good idea. She's sensing that this is going to not be great to go.
But we'll learn something and then we'll go on.
Yeah.
One more bite of watermelon.
Think of it as an experiment. Great. So here's a question for Robert. Could you please ask the doctors, are there lifestyle changes that you can recommend from a person who suffers from severe depression? And they're saying they already exercise, meditate, try to work on sleep, and have social time, journaling, gratitude, and they're taking Wellbutrin and they still have depression. I suggested that he has a session with you, but maybe you could just talk about depression a little bit, because a lot of people are experiencing it with the upcoming holidays.
Depression is a normal state of the nervous system under failure feedback. And so, in other words, you're depressed literally if you're playing poker and you've been on a winning streak and you're $230 ahead, and then you suddenly lose $50. If we watched inside your nervous system right then, we would watch a change in your neurochemistry toward, you thought you were going to win that hand, and then you're disappointed, and then you experience a loss. Now, some psychiatrist somewhere would say, oh no, Doug, that's not depression. Yes, it is. It's the same thing. There's no in principle difference between what's going on there neurochemically and what's going on in some person that's been miserably depressed and suicidal for the last 6 months. It's the same thing that's happening. What you're watching is the nervous system is attempting to signal to you that your circumstances are significantly poorer than you think that they should be. So let's look at we're going to look at 1 year. The young man is 21 years old, and he is been drafted low in the draft in the NBA. See, we're back to basketball, Jen.
Oh my God. Okay, so now another 9 minutes.
Right, and he's
no comment. keep
All
the
right.
sports metaphors
9 minutes
to
from
a
now,
dull
what
roar
else
in
we
the book.
get? All right. But the point is that he's not sure he's going to make the team, and now he makes the team, and he's extremely happy. Okay. 4 years later, he gets demoted from from the starting lineup to the bench, and he's depressed, and he's moping, and he's bitching to his wife, and he's bitching to his friends, and he's snarling about wanting a trade. Okay, he's got $30 million in the bank. So now we see that, in other words, what counts, what's causing the individual to be depressed, are not the objective circumstances, because 4 years earlier he would have looked at those circumstances and said, "Are you kidding me? You're going to pay me $10 million a year, and I'm going to be the sixth or seventh man. I would be ecstatic if that is what my future looks like." 4 years later, he's depressed about it. Okay, and he's getting his little EAP free consultations that they give so that he can save his $150 on his insurance plan for his therapy. Okay, because after all, he can't hardly afford it because he makes $10 million a year. Okay. All right. So why is that guy depressed? He's just as depressed as some high school kid who just lost the love of his life there in the 11th grade. It's the same feeling. And what that feeling is the discrepancy between what your brain thinks you should be getting for feedback from the world and the feedback that you're actually getting. It's the discrepancy that drives the feeling of depression. It's the same thing that happens when that guy puts $50 into the pot in that poker game, and he's got a full house, and he's so excited. He's just damn sure he's going to win this thing. And it turns out, nope, somebody else has a hand one notch better. And that moment where he's like, oh man, okay, is that same feeling, except we extend it out for something that's more important than $50. How important is it to lose your love of your life in the 11th grade? Well, I know, and it's a lot worse than $50. Okay. And so does the basketball player know. It's a lot more status loss than $50. It's a much bigger deal. So this person's depression is caused by the same thing that depression is caused around the world in both animals and people. And that is a discrepancy between what you think the circumstances ought to be and could be and should be versus what they are. So the solution isn't found in green beans and applesauce. That's not where it is, okay? So if you do your diet decently, then we aren't unnecessarily suffering health-wise. And if you're getting some exercise, you're not dealing from some lack of oxygenation to the brain or some, periodic endorphins that come. That's not the big deal. I can eat crappy food and have not exercised in a month and be ecstatically happy. Why? All I have to do is get good esteemed feedback from markets. So some cute gal flirting with me. It's like, whoa, what do I care that I've got crappy food in my stomach and I feel out of shape? I get positive feedback like that, my nervous system's going to light up. Of course it is. That's how it's designed. Okay. Or God forbid, John McDougall compliments me about something. I get all happy about it. All right. So the point is that this is how we're built. And so this person's the center of their depression is not going to be found in lifestyle processes per se. Those are a foundation for not exacerbating the suffering and contributing to maybe a self-disgust process of self-destruction that can sometimes happen when people are just giving up and they're frustrated. No, what we need to do is we need to look at the domains of your life that are driving the depression. It's either your romantic arena, which you don't have to have a romance, God forbid. What you have to have is you have to have evidence that your strategy for attempting to attain such a thing is reasonable and sound and has some reasonable probability of success. That's all you need. You don't need the success itself. In trade, you don't need to have a job. You need to know that you have a strategy that is reasonable that you could get such a thing. Okay. And finally, in the in friendship arena, same thing. So if any of those arenas, trade, romance, friendship, we should be looking there to see what in which of those situations what we're getting from the world is here, but we think it should reasonably be here. It could be that in 2 of those 3 domains, things are fine, but in one of those domains, it's frustrating enough that there's significant depression that's involved, okay? People can have their marriage going well and their career going well, but they're at odds with their best friend, and they're being rejected by their best friend, that they're not going to be in their best friend's wedding. And they're like, what the hell is that? And they can be really upset about it, okay? So examine what that is. And if what I'm saying lines up to your to what's actually happening inside your mind right now, great. If it doesn't, then there's a mystery there that I'm not understanding, and that's fine. But ultimately, it's very likely that that's true, and that if you need help, that's what Jen and I are here for, is for exactly ferreting out what the fundamental roots of this depression are, and then trying to come up with a strategy that's a little bit differently than the strategy that you're using now, because the strategy that you're using now is not resulting in enough positive feedback or evidence of increased, likelihood of success, that it's driving further, depression to result. So that's what I would say. I think that's it.
I
Jen?
sent Tim your podcast where you guys talked about depression, and I suggested to book a session.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I would say the only thing I would add that's great, that's the sweeping sports metaphor and all coverage of how this works. I will, kind of harkens back to the last question, where there are certain individuals who are more susceptible to this than others, so it's again, you could take 2 people and give them the same kind of feedback from the romantic arena or from the work arena. And so it's sort of this relative perception of what you expect should be happening versus what is, mixed with your personality predispositions and kind of just how you're wired in general. So different people can experience the same event and the same kind of change of fortune and have a very different kind of reaction to it, whether it's they're more likely to be depressed by it, or they're more likely to feel anxious about it, or they're more likely to have just more robust resilience to it. This is where individual differences really matter a lot. But one of the kind of high overarching concepts that we always want to communicate to people is there can be a kind of negative feedback loop that people get into when they are feeling some depressive feelings about some area of their life, or in general, they just kind of feel stuck in general. We'll hear that phrase a lot. And very often the key is that the exact thing that you don't want to do, because you're so sensitive to this process that we call failure feedback. You're so sensitive to the prospect that you're going to be rejected if you try to go on more dates, because you've experienced all of this rejection already, that's kind of the last thing that you want to do. But really the answer very often lies in this process of kind of pushing yourself out of your comfort zone and starting to take those risks that are exactly the thing that you are most allergic to at the moment because of the way you're feeling, and taking the chance on perhaps experiencing some more failure feedback, but eventually also getting some positive feedback. And that's very often the only way out of this. And so kind of building the courage to do that with some support from us or someone else is often the key to making some progress.
Great.
Grand.
Thank you.
One last thing that I would say about this. Person's on Wellbutrin, and that is that if this person's smart enough to be listening to this podcast.
Well, the person's a doctor, a medical doctor.
Good. Then they're smart enough to read Anatomy of an Epidemic. Okay. And so if you read Anatomy of an Epidemic, you're going to find the entire concept of antidepressants being challenged at its core. And I can tell you that recently, about 6 months ago, a good friend of mine who's a very, very, totally sharp academic and no spring chicken, we're peers. She's been around the block many times and read tremendous amounts of literature and was absolutely sure that I was wrong about this. Okay. And I said, we're not arguing further until you read Anatomy of an Epidemic, and then we're going to have a conversation. And I had a big fat mea culpa, about 10 days later, like, oh my God, I can't believe this.
It's a shocking book. It really
Yeah.
is a shocking book. Yeah.
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 So,
Robert Whitaker, Anatomy of an Epidemic. That's the name of the book.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really something. Opens your eyes.
Yeah, I read it. Thank you. You recommended it to me years ago. I actually listened to it on CD. It was so, and Gina, who's watching live, listen to what she says, because maybe she needs to read the book before you debate her, is if I understand correctly, Dr. Lisle says depression is only situation and not chemical. That's where we differ. There is severe depression not related to situation.
Here, now this is what Jen's trying to refer to. And that is that let's back up the camera. This is a worthwhile discussion to have and to try to clarify this for people. We're going to begin at the beginning just here for a minute. This isn't going to be long, but I want to explain why it is that I'm saying what I'm saying. I want you to understand, what do you think the cause is? What is the purpose if you put your hand on a hot cup of coffee that your hand is in pain? What do we think the reason for that is? The reason for that is to get you to draw your finger away from that. It's a high source of heat. That is the purpose, okay? The purpose of you, when you go outside and it's colder than you think it is and you start to shiver, the purpose of that and that whole experience is to get you to understand that it is very important for you to get to a source of heat, and so that your body temperature is raised. The purpose of the hunger drive is to see to it that you don't starve to death, and the purpose of thirst is to make sure that the fluid balances remain, reasonably ideal for your health and functioning. Okay, so here's the point: the purpose of all feelings, underline this and make it in bold caps. The purpose of all feelings is to orient the organism for adaptive action. That is the point, okay? Modern psychiatry is going to say, oh, no, it's just there's something, you're just having a feeling because you got weird shit going on in your neurochemistry. Wow. That's a tremendously bold statement for which they don't have any evidence at all, okay? So somebody that says, no, the reason why people are depressed is they got a serotonin imbalance of their brain. Not true. Okay, there's no evidence to support that. That's a hypothesis that was cooked up by late 20th century psychiatry. And it is not true. And you can read that story in Anatomy of an Epidemic. So now, is it possible that when you feel extreme pain in your finger, that there's actually nothing wrong with it? It's just a bunch of nerves going haywire. Yes. Okay. How many times is that likely to be true? Not very often. If you've got extreme pain in your finger, it's very likely that there's something wrong, because the entire point of having the ability to experience the pain is for it to be accurate and right. Okay. Are there times when it's not right? Yes, there are. There are times. How often is that going to happen? It better not be very useful, because then if the evolutionary design is so lousy that it's giving you really bad feedback about major dysfunction that has absolutely nothing to do with the functioning of that whole situation, that wouldn't make very much sense. You would, in fact, be pretty sure that when you feel really cold, it's cold. And when you're hungry, you're hungry. And when you're tired, okay? In other words, all feelings, and that's going to include emotion. So people somehow think that emotion, they don't even know what they're for. Okay, so I went through school and I had a PhD in clinical psychology in 1992, okay? And at the end of that, actually in 91. So in 1991, I got my PhD in clinical psychology. Guess what? I didn't know what feelings were for, okay? So when I actually told Robert Whitaker that depression is a failure feedback device, that guy was stunned. He had never heard that concept. Because Robert Whitaker, as educated as he is in the field, hadn't integrated the concept that feelings are evolutionarily designed for highly specific purposes. Okay? So depression isn't just a malaise. It is absolutely a designed feature of the organism to try to get you to change your strategy in particularly important domains of life, and the three most important domains of life for human competition, and therefore sensitivity to feedback, are going to be romance, friendship, and exchange. Okay, that's going to be what it is. So you could be on a desert island by yourself and be failing to get food, and you're going to be both hungry and depressed about it. Okay, so and you're going to be frustrated and anxious. But what I'm trying to get across here is feelings are specialized. They're the result of the activation of neural circuits designed by nature to have very specific experiences. To come in and say, oh, well, depression, there's depression that's just chemical. Well, what the hell does that mean? Why would it happen that way? Can it happen? Yep, it can happen. But it's going to be rare, people. It's going to be damn rare. Now, as Jen was saying, is going to be, just as there's people that have more voracious appetites, okay? And there's people that like to be warmer. So you check their skin temperature and they just always have a sweater on. And there's other people that like, no, cool it off. So there's individual differences in how these feelings work. And the baseline feature of human psychology is that on average, human psychology feels mildly positive, okay? In other words, that's actually the way it works. So when you ask the average human being at the average moment of their life, how are they feeling? They're not feeling neutral. They're feeling somewhat positive, which is a very interesting characteristic. It looks like that's built into life itself. Why? It's an incentive for living. Okay. Otherwise, it's like, what's the point? Okay. So there's a natural incentive for the base rate of the system to be mildly positive. Now, you can imagine that there's going to be a difference. So Alan Goldhammer, even though he doesn't look like it, is very happy. I don't know why, he's so strange, but he is, okay? He's naturally just, he's in there. So his base rate for happiness is, I can probably tell, it's probably 10% higher than mine. So we're on a bell curve, and that's just kind of how that is, all right? His son is the same way, by the way, bizarrely. So that's inherited. So what Jen's talking about is, there's people that are down here on the bell curve. Like, so their natural base rate isn't very high. Now, in fact, their natural base rate could actually be below the midline. Just like nothing is terrible is happening, but they just don't feel that good. Those people tends to be the genes that also cause anxiety. So high anxiety, high depression, those are the same suites of genes. There are thousands of them that are responsible. And so they're winding up. Those people can be sort of anxious and kind of depressed for quite a lot of their lifetime. Okay, now, we would not say, you could say, well, that's chemical. No, well, it is, but it's such innate neurochemistry based on the interaction of 10,000 different genes. So it's not like we're going to come in with some single drug and whap it. It's the natural baseline of that person. It'd be like saying, we're going to come in with something. If Susie's always cold and has to wear a sweater, even when it's 74 degrees inside the house, we're going to give her some drug because there's something haywire in her brain of its neurochemistry that makes her that way. It's like, what, are you out of your mind? We wouldn't do anything of the kind. We recognize that that's her nature. Okay, and we're not going to fix that nature to make her look more normal. That's just who she is. Alan wants to actually have his office in a freezer locker. He likes it super cold. That's just how he is. He would actually have his office at 62 degrees if anybody around could stand it. Okay, we wouldn't say, well, give him a shot, for God's sakes. Give him a combination of serotonin and norepinephrine and some damn 5 other neurochemicals and get him drugged up so that he can be normal like the rest of us. No, that's just how he is. So if you happen to be someone who's chronically on the anxious, depressed midline, no evidence at all that psychiatry has any solution for you. The person's comment of, is it chemical? Well, it's chemical in a sense. Of course it is. Every feeling and every experience and every biological action that involves life is chemical. Okay. Now, are there other things that can cause depression that are, quote, chemical? Yeah. Like, for example, you could have a low thyroid. In other words, there are occasional medical biological processes. People can be going through menopause, or they can have hormonal shifts. Yeah, those things happen. And sometimes they have a cause that maybe somebody can do something about. Usually not. Usually the body sort of heals itself in its own way, in its own good time, as long as we get decent nutrition, exercise, and sleep. But what you're hearing from me is a long, fairly heavy-handed soliloquy about the people that have bought into the underlying theory underlying psychopharm. And I think that theory has been challenged and found deeply wanting, and I think the evidence is not supportive of this. Do I think that there are people over here at the low end of the bell curve of their natural chemistry, that they have so many depressive and anxious circuits that their lives are actually pretty miserable just by virtue of being alive? I'm sure that's true. And I'm also quite confident that the psychiatric meds are useless for that.
I mean, that's the other piece, right? Like if the meds worked as you know, suggested, and they're supposed to, but that's the whole other argument in Whitaker's book and elsewhere, is that they actually don't work as they're supposed to. So if people did want to correct their particular chemical situation because they were at a lower baseline of good feeling in general, then that would be one thing, and we could kind of have a conversation about that. But the outcomes don't match up with those intentions, and that's just an important part of the conversation to have as well.
That's why from our standpoint, the only thing that you can do about the situation is situational. The only thing that's all we can do. We can't go in and change 10,000 genes that result in an unbelievably complicated interaction of the process of your own personal neurochemistry that cause you to be sitting down at the 15th percentile for the happiness bell curve. Okay, that there's Wellbutrin isn't going to fix that. So, and that's sort of 2 books for somebody this smart to read to really sort of synthesize this argument. Is number 1 Whitaker, and second is to read Blueprint by Plomin. So
the abnormal is normal. That's what I keep thinking with this conversation. I mean, Plomin really describes that wherever you are in this bell curve, this phrase normal comes from the sort of a word play on a bell curve is also called a normal curve. And so there is natural variation. There's natural, if we were to take 1,000 people in Seattle and put them in a room that was 65 degrees, they would fall on a bell curve of how comfortable they were at that temperature. Most people might be kind of on the chilly side. Some people would be a little too warm. Some people would be freezing. And that's exactly what you see with sort of baseline affect and mood. And so if you're way out on the edge of the normal curve, you're abnormal because there aren't that many people like you. You're not as common as the other people who have a different sort of baseline, whether it's a tolerance for temperature or a hunger drive or propensity for depression or anything else. But you're still normal. You're supposed to be there. You're supposed to be part of that distribution. There's nothing pathological or wrong with you, and there's nothing that we need to correct for to make you more like the middle of the bell curve. That's making a value judgment about the middle of the bell curve, saying, oh, this is the best way to be just because it's the most common way to be. And that is a really backwards way of looking at human nature. And Plomin does a beautiful job of talking about that.
Yeah, it might be pleasant to be more normal. You know what I mean?
Depending, sure. Yeah.
An awful lot of my clients are actually, quote, they've got a lot of the genes for anxious and depression. That's why they're talking to us. Mm-hmm. And they just happen to be up in the top 2 or 3 percentile. And as a result of that, there's suffering that goes with that. Oh, well, in other words, our job is to maneuver their environments around to try to mitigate that as much as possible. But the truth is that it just because you're out, I mean, as Jen is saying, you're just a part of the normal distribution. It can be inconvenient and frustrating. If you're mentally retarded and you're at the 2nd percentile for IQ, that is a set of circumstances that is unpleasant and is going to handicap you in many ways. But there's nothing wrong with you. Okay, there's nothing wrong. That's just the luck of the draw. Okay, so that's what's driving this. And if it's not driving the depression, then what's driving the depression are these failure feedback cues and some frustration in domains. And that's what psychotherapy can do. To the extent that psychotherapy can do anything, the only thing it can do is it can make you essentially give you better strategies for addressing the challenges where your feedback from the world isn't where it is that you think it could be or should be. And we can pursue that discrepancy. It could be that you're wrong, and you actually need to be here. You think that you're going to be the number one trumpet in the Philharmonic one day because you're number 4 right now and you're frustrated and you think you should be higher. But we may discover that no, in fact, you're about where you belong by doing everything possible to triangulate your competitive efforts. Okay. We may shift to the other Philharmonic and find out whether or not it's the director's fault or whether or not you've got a screw loose. So the point is that we don't know what's going to happen, whether we're going to raise your performance and therefore eliminate your depression that way, or we're going to get you used to the fact that we've done everything possible to get you higher where you thought you could be, but you can't, and now you make peace with it. And people say, oh, that doesn't sound like a good thing. I don't think I can make peace with it. No. It's like, oh yeah, kids do it every day. Literally 85% of 8th grade boys think that they're going to be professional athletes. Okay. 1 in 10,000, that will be the case. So that means 1,500 out of 10,000 are not delusional because they don't think they're going to be professional athletes. But 8,499 out of the last 8,500 are going to be disappointed. Okay. When they're disappointed, it doesn't devastate their life or cause much depression. A few of them it will, the ones that got very close and didn't get there. Okay.
Or the ones that are so far down the bell curve that they're going to be upset at the very smallest sort of perceived slight in life. So again, both of those things matter, the sort of actual nature of the situation and your underlying predispositions.
Yes.
Yeah. And if you mix the two together, if you take somebody who like always feels like they just are never getting what they deserve, and they come what they believe to be very close, then they're going to be bitter about that for life. It's going to come up every time they go to the neighborhood bar. I mean, there are rom-coms made about this, right? There's the character who sits at the bar who's 46. Yeah. And he's talking about his highlight reel from when he was a senior football player. Yeah.
How it got derailed by the coach that didn't see his greatness.
Oh, I could have been somebody, like it should have been different. You know, it was everybody else's fault and screw them. And if they hadn't screwed up my life, like I'd be Tom Brady. Look, I made a sports analogy.
I was congratulating myself.
But yeah, I mean, those people do exist and we recognize them. I think most people, there's a reason they're a cliche in movies is because they are sort of unusual. They're wired in a particular way that sort of just makes them especially resentful about things that most of us would be like, hey, them's the breaks, you know, it doesn't always, life doesn't, it's kind of unfair and it kind of sucks, but I've moved on. Some people don't move on and the abnormal is normal.
Yep. Yeah.
I just want to say that there's a lot of comments in the chat, and these are said with love, by the way, that they appreciate the thorough answers, and now they know why it's taken so long for the book to come out.
Yeah, you should be a fly on the wall when we're working through a new concept. It's hours, it's weeks and weeks and weeks of back and forth.
All right. Great.
And Morgan, who was the first question answer, is also watching live and thanks you both very much for the opportunity to be able to ask the question and have it answered. You know, first of all, I agree with you, and I've read all the books you recommend. I've known a few people, though, and these are people that are not unstable. They have great emotional stability, that have had really horrific things happen to them, like the murder of a child, that I've seen get depressed. You know, and I don't think that's not failure feedback, is that?
Yes, it is. That's exactly what that is.
Really?
So yeah, in other words, they've experienced a loss, right? So they failed to protect that individual. So this is what this is. So their mind has to go back over and over and over and over and over 10,000 times. What could I have done differently? Was there something that I could have done? Yeah, that's what that is, AJ. It's
again this mismatch between what you think the world should look like versus what is in front of you. And if that's a big gap, if you've been taken aback by real life suddenly not lining up with your expectations, that's going to cause extreme emotion in some direction. You could be so over rewarded by that. You're like, I won the lottery. Like, I didn't expect that to happen. This is a really unusual permutation of my reality. So I'm going to have a big emotional response. And something like this is a similar big emotional response, but in the other direction. And so these things tend to self-correct over time as you go through and you run the scenario and you discover that, what happened, your role in what happened was, properly calibrated after you've thought about it enough. But there's a bell curve there too, where some people need to run more of those cycles than other people who get over it very quickly.
Yes.
Right. So people kind of return to their baseline personality at some point.
Most of the time. Yeah.
Yeah, I love what you said about don't medicate the personality. I had the Stanford psychiatrist Anna Lemke, who's from the documentary Social Networking on, and she said the same thing. So not all psychiatrists are for these medicines.
That's amazing. I never heard that phrase. Did Jen say that and you copied it, AJ? That's great.
Well, no, Anna Lemke said it. She wrote a book called Dopamine Nation. I had her on the show.
Yeah.
And she said that at one point, either she was on them or considering them for herself, and she didn't like the idea of having to medicate her personality.
Beautifully said. That meme's going to stick in our heads.
Yeah. I mean, that's what this all is. That's what medication for ADD and ADHD for kids is. That's what all of this is. And so stepping back and really taking a look at it and reading books like Dopamine Nation and Anatomy of an Epidemic gives some much needed perspective here.
Great. Thank you.
Fran.
Dr. Lisle said, this is from Mark, by the way, Dr. Lisle said, as I understood it, that his cholesterol runs 225 to 250 and that he is not concerned about it because his diet is great and other markers are good. Is the same concept applicable to blood pressure? My BP runs high, been on a whole food plant-based diet for over 10 years, SOS free. Since I stayed at TrueNorth 5 years ago, fasted there 4 times. Blood pressure is lower than it was before the diet and the fast, but it still runs in the 140s or 150s, systolic often, cholesterol in the 140s. I've decided not to worry about it. I still go back to TrueNorth for a fast every couple of years for a variety of reasons, but I'm not going to spend my time worrying about the BP. Is this the right decision, Mark?
Exactly the right decision. So let's look at this. So just quickly here, if I can, there's 2 different, the blood pressure is like cholesterol. Blood pressure is seen as it's a marker for trouble. So that's why there's a correlation between higher blood pressure and then greater amounts of vascular disease. That's a correlation, that is not a causal factor. Okay, so correlation holds pretty well because in general, the dietary features that drive higher blood pressure will also drive the vascular disease. That's exactly analogous to cholesterol. So the cholesterol is correlated, but not causal with respect to heart disease. So it's the animal protein that comes with the animal food that also comes with cholesterol, but when you eat it, drives up your cholesterol. So if I were to, but if you're not eating the animal protein with the cholesterol in it, but your cholesterol is naturally high, that's just caused by your own liver and your own individual biology. Okay, so again, this is precisely analogous. So if this person is, let's suppose that their cholesterol runs high, and their blood pressure runs high, but it's not for any pathological reason. It's just that's where it runs. In principle, it could be a derivative of some pathological condition that would have nothing to do with diet. Okay. And we would hope that isn't true, and we would hope that cardiologists can do their little tests and then put their stethoscope on your heart and find nothing strange that's driving that relatively high blood pressure. But the blood pressure, in terms of a causal agent, about where we see the correlations that scare us, are going to be in strokes. So that's the big issue. And it's going to turn out there's 2 different kinds of strokes. One of them is where you throw a clot, and the other one is where you burst a blood vessel because the pressure is too high. Okay. So throwing a clot, that's going to happen when you have vascular disease as a result of a bad diet. Okay. If the person has a very good diet, then we're not going to have any indication of vascular disease, i.e. if their C-reactive protein is very low, as it should be, then we don't have any reason on earth to be worried about throwing a clot. None. Whether your blood pressure's 110 or your blood pressure's 160, it doesn't increase your likelihood to throw a clot what your blood pressure is. It's a statistical relationship that if you happen to have 160 blood pressure, probably you have a shitty diet, and therefore you probably have vascular disease, which is why you're far more likely to throw a clot. But blood pressure doesn't cause you to throw a clot, it's a correlate. okay? That represents almost all strokes. In fact, it represents about 90% of all strokes are throwing clots. So this person is eating a diet where they're not going to throw a clot. So that we have now parked 90% of the threat that, quote, high blood pressure is associated with. The remaining 10% is going to be hemorrhagic strokes, where a blood vessel bursts as a result of not being able to structurally handle the pressure of the high blood pressure. Now, at 140-ish, very low odds of having something like that happen. However, statistically, you are at higher odds of having that happen than if your blood pressure is at 120. But where it really gets exciting, just so that people know, is up around 170, 180, 190. Okay. So when people have blood pressures of, say, 200 over 100, they're pretty likely one day, sometime in the next 10 years, to have a hemorrhagic stroke. It's like, wow, you are putting so much pressure on those pipes that something's going to burst. Okay, hopefully not the big one. You may have a small stroke, but if your blood pressure is 200 over 100 and it's been there for a few years, look out in the next decade, because we look at the chart, and I don't know what the odds are, but they're pretty decent. Okay, that would be like having cholesterol of 350 and you're eating burgers with all four hands and feet, and you're 100 pounds overweight, and it's like, you know what, you're a walking heart attack candidate, or you're a walking stroke candidate at 200 over 100. You're not a walking stroke candidate, hemorrhagic stroke candidate at 140. Okay, so when you look at the relationship between blood pressure scores and strokes, remember that at 140, and the reason they're screaming about it and they want to lower it down to borderline high blood pressure at 130, why? They want to sell you medications. And what those medications do is they're forcing the blood pressure down artificially by putting pressure on the kidneys to reduce your fluid balance. And as a result, they're reducing the likelihood of hemorrhagic stroke. They are not reducing the likelihood of embolisms. This is true for all blood pressure. If your blood pressure is at 180, when you take blood pressure medicine and you force it down to 150, which is very aggressive on the body to do that, that 30 points will reduce your likelihood of hemorrhagic stroke. But remember how I said that hemorrhagic stroke's only 10% of the strokes. So you're reducing the likelihood of only 10%. You are not reducing the likelihood of embolisms, which is 90% of the stroke risk. Okay. So in other words, the blood pressure medication, as you would expect, is almost totally worthless because it's only working on a small percentage of the strokes. So blood pressure medication will show positive effects for increased life expectancy only when we make sure that we are aiming at the very highest levels of blood pressure. Okay, so there's like no scientific justification, to the best of my knowledge, for using blood pressure medication to pull blood pressures down when blood pressures aren't consistently at least 160. Okay, and even then, it's weak. So for this individual, my attitude is the only thing I'm worried about is that you're doing such a good job and you're at 140. I'm kind of not sure why. Okay, it's a little surprising to me, but I sure as hell wouldn't be thinking about medicating it. I would be thinking about making sure you have a consult with somebody smart and savvy about this. God forbid. Now he's gonna. I'm finally gonna get an email from Peter Sultana to say, "Don't say my name again for the rest of your life." Okay, but you go to the TrueNorth website if you want a consultation with somebody that would be very wise about this. Peter Sultana would always be my number one choice, and then there's other doctors there. But if you've got a quirky medical problem that you're not sure of and you're not sure which direction to go, get a consultation. And the TrueNorth website is a good place to look for a doc that is going to be plant-based and smart.
Yeah, and these are virtual consultations. I mean, 20-minute quick chats that you can do from afar. So you're not going in there, and it's not a full medical appointment. It's just a conversation about something just like this from an MD or an ND.
Perfect.
Thanks. John, who's watching live, says this is one of the most interesting, valuable, and shareable sessions I've been part of. Thank you.
Aw.
Oh, terrific.
Yeah.
It's all the sports analogies.
Yeah.
That's great. Well, I want to respect your time. If you want to stop now, we can, or there are two more questions, but we can always get you back.
Let's knock them out. We won't let me talk.
Okay.
Famous last words.
Nice. If you don't mind, I'm just going to ask a really quick question. I should have asked it earlier. People have so much trouble with their family and at the holidays. Was this the case in the Stone Age? Like, has this always been the case that people have trouble with their family relationships?
I mean, I don't think we know. I don't think we have a lot of great anthropological, sociological data about Stone Age relationships. We have some, but we're not looking at kind of annualized holidays like we have now, where it's this thing. It's this big thing where you make a trek and you go, and this is the only time you see these people that you have kind of an iffy relationship with anyway. I mean, what we do know about the Stone Age is that it was the same people all the time, that everything was, there were no kind of special moments. I mean, of course, there were ritualistic religious ceremonies and things like this, but not like we have now, where there's this big commercialized, occasion for everybody to kind of be on their worst behavior and drink a lot and everything else that goes with the holidays. So I think there's a whole bunch of things that go on with the holidays in the modern era that were not at all present in the Stone Age, that lead us into this kind of artificial self-reflection that goes on, and also engagement with and proximity to people that are most of the time pretty problematic, that we're steering clear from, that we feel obligated to spend time with because it's the holidays. So you put all those things together, we're already having kind of an existential crisis because this is the time of year that we do that. And then we have to hang out with all of our problematic drunk cousins, and that just throws a lot of people into pretty predictable crisis. So yeah, but as for Stone Age life, a lot of that we're just kind of we're guessing as to what some of those dynamics would have looked like.
Great, thanks. Okay, so here's a question from.
We didn't let you talk.
Oh, did you want to say something about that, Dr. Lisle?
Nothing.
Okay, perfect. Fiona asks, how would you explain the motivation behind truly non-observer dependent acts of kindness, which are 100% anonymous? Could this somehow be linked to our own internal esteem mechanisms? It's called a mitzvah in Judaism.
Oh yeah, mitzvah. Well, mitzvah is a clever way to hide a little Easter egg for people to find later, and then we get a bunch of credit for it. So it's an investment. It's basically like a stake in a startup company. So if you are an early investor, you can get 1,000-fold return. Where if you're a late investor, maybe you get a 5-to-1 return if it's a good investment. So that's what's going on there. The adaptive unconscious of the human being knows that is a possible big win to do it that way. So it doesn't have to be. Undoubtedly, there are people that are consciously and deliberately aware that they are sowing the seeds of the discovery of their mitzvah. I have no doubt that happens often. Okay. However, it is also very possible and would be evolutionarily sound to have that happen on occasion. That there would be both individuals sitting on different places of the bell curve for their personalities, as well as sets of circumstances that probabilistically lead to the fact that you're going to do something wonderful, and it very, very well may be discovered at some point in the future. Okay, and so that you could have an evolutionary design of great, deep patience that could run that CB analysis and understand that if that gets tripped over later, if I do 5 of those, if I do 10 of them in the next 10 years, and any one of those gets discovered 3 years after I do it, the value to me is going to be huge. The reason why is if people ever discover these, they make the inference that you are actually out there quietly. Basically, you are a net producer. You are a net giver. In other words, you are net altruistic. And if you could get the reputation of being a net altruist, literally, you give more than you take. In other words, you obviously are doing exchanges in the village all along that are probably fair and reasonable, but you are quietly putting your thumb on the scale and turning around and giving more when you don't need to. Well, if you get that reputation, then you are inherently more valuable than the guy standing right next to you that doesn't do that. So it's actually a super elegant, deceptive, deep strategy of advertising your value to the village. So that's what a mitzvah is. And sorry, that doesn't mean it's a bad thing. It just means that's what it is. And so, and you can feel very good, sowing a little mitzvah out there. It can make you feel like, yeah, I've got a little stock. I've got 1,000 shares of stock in that little startup company out there that may turn out to be nothing, or it may turn out to be Apple Computer, but I got in early. So it can be a nice feeling if you can afford it to do such things. And some people have the psychology that makes them afford that very easily, and they like it. They like that feeling. So that's what that is.
Yeah, there's also that's right, very, very welcome, I'm sure. There's also just kind of a subjective, with a lot of this type of thing, a feeling that it's a down payment towards some sort of mystical karmic outcome that you're just basically, you maybe it won't tally up in the end, but if you do find yourself at the pearly gates or you're being assigned whatever sort of creature you're going to reincarnate as, it might count toward the overall balance in your favor. I think that's a lot of kind of in the background. And then the suggestion that it is an internal audience phenomenon, I think there's a validity to that too. There's sort of, yep. I am confirming for myself that I am the kind of person who does this kind of thing. And that means that I am a good, valuable person in the village. And so even if this never becomes known, it might become known. I might let it slip in a couple of years. Someone might discover it, or someone might suspect that it's me. But even if it doesn't, it feels good for me because I'm showing my internal audience that I'm a good person. These things are totally part of the equation.
Yeah, they're all a gestalt. This whole notion of karma is exactly what this is. Karma is a totally legitimate, probabilistic engine of esteem processes in the Stone Age village. And so it's, of course, very reasonable that it's not unreasonable at all that we would have a conscious concept of it. Okay? Right. And by the way, everybody, if I've ever done anything good, God forbid I ever forget, because I make sure somewhere I'm going to tell.
Yeah, no, I'm not in the dark about any of your good deeds. not hidden from view. I'll send you a fruit basket.
Except he doesn't like presents, he said.
No, he doesn't.
No.
But I find that when I do random acts of kindness, it makes me feel good in the moment.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Exactly. Well, it would have to. I mean, this is, again, feelings or feedback. You feel good because you're doing something that is advantageous for your survival and reproduction in the grand scheme of things. So that you've been engineered to produce a good little feeling for doing something that puts you at an advantage.
Great. Thanks. All right. So the last question is obviously from someone that listens to your podcast, because I don't understand it at all, but it is. Can the frowned upon practice of being a snob based on the assessment of a potential pair bond's background lineage be an evolutionary mechanism to protect against genetic mistakes in a potential mate?
Well, I have to draw that.
I think that translates to is there sort of an EP justification for racism in dating, basically? Is that, or sort of like background lineage, I assume to mean sort of race or class or ethnicity. So is there sort of a justification for ruling people out on that basis? That's how I interpret that question.
Yeah. Maybe so. Well, thoughts, Jen?
Yeah. I mean, that'd be a good podcast question. I'm painting it with a very wide brush to kind of make it more just to interpret it for the purposes of this conversation. I think any kind of when you're in the dating market and you are implicitly ruling people out or in based on any kind of attribute, whether it's race, class, gender, background, anything, you are doing so based on specific individual preferences that could be emanating from your personality, or they could be this kind of, I think what you're getting at, this kind of tribal preservation sort of phenomenon, where you're trying to stay in the in-group. And I think we try, people have a lot of people have an inclination to stay in the in-group, defined in all kinds of different ways. So some people might define that like you grew up in a certain way. Some people might define that and you look a certain way. I think that is a strong human tendency, but not necessarily a universal one, and not expressing itself the same way in every single relationship all the time. So it's a really complicated question, and we could definitely get into it on the podcast and go deep with the evolutionary logic of that. But that's kind of the general take I would sweep at it right now. Do you have any other thoughts on that?
Yeah, I have to chart that question out.
Yeah.
You know what? I'll send it to you guys, and then you can choose to answer it on a podcast, because I didn't even understand it. So thanks. Well, this has been fantastic. We got through all the submitted questions. Guys, submit them in advance if you want priority. Any just parting thoughts on the upcoming holidays? Because a lot of people are going to be tempted with bad food and bad family.
Often at the same time. Yeah.
Yeah, my attitude, two things. Number one, eat your piles of wet starch. And number two, you got a bunch of stuff around your house the day after, just throw it out. Just grit your teeth and realize that if you throw out $100 worth of food, that's one of the best investments that you're going to make this year. Okay. So that's be willing to throw the crap out. That's a useful thing to know.
Yep.
I do. I have in case anyone listening is interested and wants that extra support, I have a women's group every Sunday that is underway now, but going through right after New Year's, called Getting Real, which we're dealing with a lot of pleasure trap, family dynamic type stuff. So you can sign up for that on my website, which is jenhawk.com.
And I'll post that in the chat. Well, guys, thank you so much. I learned so much today. I really appreciate it.
Anytime.
Thanks for having us.
Well, thank you. And thanks all of you for watching another episode of Chef AJ Live. Please come back in 2 hours for a bonus show when I have Mark Schatzker talking about his new book, The End of Craving. Take care.